Welcome back to the Philly Film Room podcast. Along with Eric Sidewater, I'm Nick Waters, and today we have a great episode for you. We're going to be discussing in depth the interior defensive line position. And if you haven't already, check out our 3 previous episodes where we do a deep dive on Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, and Milton Williams. Those are great companions to this podcast. Now, having said that, to kick off the conversation, let's jump to a mailbag question. And today's question: Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter both started the year hot last season. Do you think they can maintain that success for a whole season this year? And do you expect them to? Eric, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. So it's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I think Davis and Carter will both have better years than they did last year, but I do not expect them to maintain that success for the whole season. I have legitimate concerns that Fangio will play them too many snaps and they'll wear down towards the end of the year, like I saw with Wilkins and Sealer on the Dolphins. And Wilkins, I can speak for Wilkins specifically. He's a very talented player. So there's somewhat analogous to Carter in that sense. And I saw some pretty considerable wear down. These guys were playing 80% of the possible defensive snaps that they could have over the year. Fangio is very aggressive in terms of playing his best players a lot. And this is why in his press conference he mentioned that conditioning will be a huge factor. And I understand it's the player's responsibility and the team's expectation that they will get in great condition and be able to play that many snaps. That being said, these guys don't have a track record of showing that they can do that. So yes, it's possible, but without the track record and the visible wear that you saw last year, I think it's justified to be concerned about it. So, if I had to summarize it, I would say, over the first 10 weeks or so, I think they'll be even better than they were last year. And then they'll show some decline towards the end of the year, maybe similar to what they did last year. So net overall, I think they'll be better, but I am certainly concerned about maintaining that success.
Yeah, so I'll just touch on what you said about Fangio kind of overusing these guys. Just to give an idea of the increase in snap share that we can kind of think or project for these guys, is let's look back at Fangio's past history. If you go through all of his seasons since 2015 when he first started with the Bears, if you add up all of the interior defensive line snaps that those teams played and look at who had the highest snap share of those snaps, they had their top players, like their studs, will get 33% of those snaps or higher. So those were Akeem Hicks, Christian Wilkins, and Zach Sealer. Now, some people think Zach Sealer isn't a stud. He probably isn't, but he ended up with 10 sacks last season, so I think he's probably a little better than people give him credit for. Now, I think I differ a little bit from you in that I think he's going to overuse Jalen Carter. I wouldn't say overuse, but I think Jalen Carter is going to play a lot more snaps next season. Played in the 500, a little over 550 snaps this past season. I think he's going to play in the 800 snap range next season. So that's going to be a big jump for him. Now, he's a little bit smaller than, well, I shouldn't say a little bit. He is smaller than Jordan Davis. So I think he is the one that's more likely to be able to take on a bigger snap load. It's just harder for those big guys to have better conditioning. But other than Akeem Hicks or the 1 year with Wilkins and Sealer getting over 30% of the snaps, there wasn't a single other player that played above 30% of those snaps. So he will spread out some of his snaps amongst the other guys, but the guys that are your studs, and Jalen Carter, no doubt about it, is a stud. Those other guys kind of rotate a little bit more, and I expect Jordan's probably going to rotate a little bit more. I think he's going to be a guy. I just don't see him reaching the heights of the snap at the upper limit of the snap shares, just because of the fact that I don't think he's going to play a ton of third downs. He's going to be limited to first and second downs. So I think that is going to top out a little bit. But even then, he didn't play that many snaps last season. If you look at where he ranked among all interior defensive linemen, and he still wore down. So I think it's going to be important that he does probably slim down a little bit and increase that conditioning so he can play more. And the same with Jalen Carter. And Vic Fangio made light of that in recent press conferences. So, it's an issue that I think everyone's aware of, or maybe not so much an issue, but something, an expectation that they take on more snaps next season, especially Jalen Carter. He is a guy that is going to play a lot more. Now, in terms of them starting hot last season, then kind of slowing down a little bit, I think a lot of that also had to do with the competition level they played. And the first half of the season, really right up until they met the Cowboys, I think it was week 8, and then had a bye. Before then, they played a lot of either bad interior offensive lines, or they played a lot of interior offensive lines that were dealing with major injuries, or they're playing teams with rookie guards. The Patriots were down to they're down their first 2 guards in week 1, so they're playing their third and fourth string guards in week 1. So of course you'd expect Jalen Carter to take advantage of those guys. You can go through a number of other teams. The Bucks were playing a backup center. They were also playing a rookie at guard. Just a few other examples. But then they get to the second half of the season. They play the Cowboys twice, who have 2 All-Pro guards, and Dak Prescott doesn't take a ton of sacks to begin with. Then they play the Chiefs, who, for Pat Mahomes, he does take a lot of pressures because he holds onto the ball a long time to try and hit big plays. But he's so crafty, he hardly takes sacks. And on top of that, it's probably between the Eagles and now that Kelsey's retired, it's probably the Chiefs that have the best interior trio in terms of guard, center, guard. They have 2 All-Pro. They have an All-Pro at guard and an All-Pro at center. And Trey Smith is an All-Pro, or he's a Pro Bowl caliber player himself. So of course those guys are going to struggle a little bit more. Then you look at the Bills. Josh Allen had a very low sack rate, and then you look at the Niners. They, again, a good team. They just don't take a ton of sacks. So you expect those guys to slow down a bit. So I think that was a big factor in it. But I think they did wear down. Both of those guys played in deep rotations when they played in Georgia, and that was a big factor. They played the most snaps of their career last year. So I'm not surprised that they did wear down a little bit. They just weren't. I just don't think they knew that the extra steps that they needed to take to get ready for that season, and really understanding that conditioning is a huge part of it in a long season, and especially being able to play deep into the fourth quarter. So, and on top of that, the defense kind of fell apart as a whole everywhere. So, like, everyone kind of gets a downgrade during that point of the season. But there was still, especially the second half of the season, I think it got a little overstated just how much they fell off. There were still some dominant moments from both of those guys in terms of Jalen Carter as a pass rusher and Jordan Davis in the run game. They wasn't as consistent in the second half of the season. But it's not something I'm that worried about overall. But I think, you know what? This is a great way to kick off the conversation today, to look at the defensive line as a unit. And Eric, what would you say, looking at the interior defensive linemen, what the strength is of this unit going into next season? What are they best at?
Yeah, it's obviously Jalen Carter in all facets of the game. As we discussed in the Jalen Carter episode, this guy in his second year might be a top 5 interior defensive lineman. So he's clearly the class of that group. And then when Davis, we mentioned this in the Davis episode, when he's not huffing and puffing during the game and not getting as worn down over the course of the season, he looks really good, especially in one-on-one matchups. I would go so far as to say is when he's not tired and he's in a 1-1 matchup, he's winning most of the time. He's insanely strong, and he's got good leg drive, and he's able to collapse the pocket. And I was critical of him against double teams, but I think a lot of that was down to conditioning. I am optimistic that if he is in better condition, that he'll be able to absorb double teams in the sense that the goal is you want to just clog up all of the lanes for like run lanes towards the middle of the line. You're not even necessarily responsible for making the tackle. So I think he can do that. And so to me, those are the strengths of the unit.
Yeah, I mean the strength of the unit is obviously Jalen Carter. Especially as a pass rusher, more so. I think there's some stuff he needs to work on in the run game. He can be quite inconsistent, and oftentimes he's playing pass first and gets caught in bad positions. But I expect that to improve as he progresses throughout his career. He definitely has the tools to be a dominant force in both the run and pass game. But the strength is definitely Jalen Carter, and this is I think that he is going to be such a good player that if anyone's watched this channel, they know I'm probably the biggest Bryce Huff fan you can find, other than Bryce Huff's mom. But I think they need to build this pass rush game plan around Jalen Carter. And we discussed a little bit in the Jalen Carter episode how they do that. I'll just touch on it briefly. What the Dolphins did last year with Christian Wilkins was used him on a lot of pick stunts. So Zach Sealer would come in and essentially pick off a guard, the center that was trying to double team with the guard on Wilkins, and then he would loop inside, and it freed him up for so many unblocked looks that it just made Wilkins went from a career high 4.5 sacks to 9 sacks last season. So I think we should see similar stuff for Jalen Carter just to make his life easier. Because the thing is, he had one unblocked pressure last season. Christian Wilkins had 20. Zach Sealer had 14. The Dolphins had 39 total unblocked pressures from their interior defensive line unit. That was 20 more than the second place team and the most since 2015. So I think we're definitely going to see Fangio implement that into the defense this year. On top of that, I also think you did touch on Jordan Davis is a good run defender. I think obviously that's a strength as well. But I'll touch on some of the other guys. I think Milton Williams is also a very good run defender, and so is Moro Ojomo. I have my eye on. I think he's a. It's hard to say he's going to be a breakout star. I just don't think he's going to get the snaps to do that, and I don't think he's going to play enough pass downs to show out as a pass rusher. And I don't know if that's ever going to be a strength of his game. What I saw from him last year in his limited reps was a really good run defender. There was a number of plays against the Cardinals last year where he plays that 4-eye technique in their 5-down fronts, and he's reading and reacting, and he is dominating the lineman. Like there was one play where I think he's more lined up as a 3 technique on the outside shoulder of the guard, and the offense is trying to run counter and down block him with the tight end. He reads the movement of the guard, sees the down block coming. Great lower body or pad level. Great lockout. He's got long arms for a player of his height. Pries that offensive tackle shoulder open, and then finishes with a tight arm over to clear himself, clog the lane, and force the run to bounce outside. Like this was a textbook play that you just don't really expect to see from a 7th round rookie who blew my mind that he went in the 7th round. So I'm very high on Ojomo. I think these are guys that can be good supplements to Jalen and Jordan in the run game. And if you haven't seen the Milton Williams episode yet, check that out because we discuss more in depth about how good he is as a run defender. So I think they have some good, solid run defenders. I think if we look at maybe the weaknesses of the unit, I'm a little concerned who is going to be the second pass rusher outside of Jalen Carter. Because if you look at who the Eagles have on their roster, it's not pretty. Both Jordan Davis and Milton Williams ranked pretty low in terms of their pressure rates and their pass rush win rates from interior defensive linemen. They didn't play a ton on third downs, so that does hurt their numbers a little bit. But even when taking into account just their third down pass rushes, they just were not much better. And I think a lot of people think Milton Williams is going to step into that role, but the thing is, they needed a second pass rusher last season. Fletcher Cox played about average or maybe a little bit above average, but he needs to. They were looking for someone to help out Jalen Carter as a pass rusher inside, and Milton had if he was a better pass rusher, the coaches probably would have put him out there more. Or I would have hoped, but who knows what the coaching staff last season. I don't know. So I think finding that second pass rusher is going to be important. Whoever it is going to be something to look for, and it may end up being a weakness of this team. And also, in addition to that, it's just I hope they bring in one more bigger body because as much as like I like Milton Williams and Moro Ajomo, they're both on the smaller side, and so I didn't get to see a ton from Ojomo. But Milton Williams, he can get moved against double teams some. So if you're facing a team that's going to run a lot of these gap scheme runs that are they're just trying to get two guys on one and move you, can we find another guy in free agency that can kind of be a gap plugger that can hold his ground against some of those blocks?
Yeah, what I identified as the weaknesses were Davis's conditioning. I think it will continue to be a concern next year. Even I know they're putting a greater emphasis on it, but with the amount of snaps I think he'll be asked to play, I'm not highly optimistic on that. And the other thing is veteran leadership. The most experienced interior defensive lineman on the team is Williams, and he's in his 4th year. So I definitely view that as a weakness, especially considering how many veterans that the Eagles have had in past seasons, and now the cupboard is bare.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of leads us to our next question. Are there any players that you would like to add? Is there any free agents that maybe you think would be a good fit for this team to come in and kind of fill that role?
Yeah, and if anyone follows me on social media, they'll hear me talk about this guy all the time. It's Calais Campbell. I think he's a perfect fit for the fronts that will like to play. I know he's pushing 40 years old, but he still looks really good as a run defender. And although he doesn't offer much as a pass rusher, he's like 6'8", and sometimes when the interior D lineman gets stymied, and you notice other teams did this way more than the Eagles, and it always annoyed me, is they'll stick their hands up and either they'll block the quarterback's vision, sometimes they'll tip a pass, sometimes they'll even intercept it. And one of the vulnerabilities of some of the defenses Fangio likes to run, these combo zones, is seam passes. And I could just envision Campbell, 6'8", sticking his arms up and just deterring a lot of those types of passes. And of course, he's an amazing veteran who I've heard anecdotally is really good in the locker room. And he could be had on the cheap, and presumably he'll want to go for a team that's a contender. So it's almost like the trifecta of reasons that he would be a great fit person to bring in.
Yeah, he ended up playing defensive end for the Falcons last season, so I wasn't able to compare numbers from last season. But the season before that, he played a lot more on the interior. I think it was for the Ravens. Now he still, and 2 seasons ago, his interior run stop rate was top 25, I believe. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was top 25 out of 150 interior defensive linemen. I mean, that's really good. And like he has the traits that like not only the experience, but like his arms are so long that, and just combined with his height, it allows him to lock out and shed and control gaps. And that's stuff that has allowed him to continue and extend his career as long as it has. And he's a guy that he doesn't need to play a ton of these snaps. He can come in certain roles, especially like I mentioned, if they're playing a team that likes to run a lot of gap scheme runs, he can come in and if Milton's getting washed out or Jomo's getting washed out of those plays, all right, let's go and stick a bigger body in there and play that role. We're not looking for him to come in and play 400, 500, 600 snaps. His body just not going to be meant for that. But he can come in and play his role and do his part to hopefully get this team, to a championship and see if he can ride out into the sunset with a ring. Now,
Real quick on
what?
him, I was thinking about the Eagles when they brought in Linval Joseph
Yeah,
and
and Sue.
Ndamukong Suh, two veteran guys, and they came way later in the season. Now that I think about it, I wouldn't be shocked if Campbell wasn't even on a roster week one, kind of was seeing how the season materialized and then joined a team. I mean, it's not like he needs the money or anything,
No.
um, and he could just stay fresh. So I could envision that happening, and it's kind like with you know, I'll be very excited if they go after him.
Yeah, exactly like you said. I mean, go and get those veterans, and I think it is a situation where, and the Eagles have been doing this the past several years. It's you kind of wait until middle of the season. What is our weakness? Or are we dealing with injury? Go out and get that guy to fill it, like they did it, like you said, with Linval Joseph and Ndamukong Suh last 2 years ago. Bradley Roby uh, didn't have quite as big of an impact, especially as what Linval Joseph had, but it was a similar vein of, okay, is there a veteran out there that can plug this hole? And you know what? These guys probably a lot of times don't want to. First of all, he ain't signing before training camp. He does not want to go through training camp. There's no need for him. He is a veteran. He's played in the league for like 15 years. He's gonna wait until the season starts to sign with the team. Um, if I'm wrong, come back and make fun of me in the comments. But I mean, I listen. I think he's probably going to wait until middle of the season. Who are the contenders? Can I save some snaps on my leg and then come in for that stretch run? So I think that's a great fit for the team, and I think the Eagles are going to be in play for it. But I think it's going to be later in the season. Now, like I mentioned,
I've
oh,
heard
go ahead.
they're interested. I've actually heard from a beat reporter that they're interested. So
Yeah.
I
And
don't.
maybe he
Yeah.
does maybe he does sign earlier, but I think if I'm a veteran of that caliber right now and I haven't signed by now, like you're not getting big money, right? You're not playing for money at that point in time. You're want to wait to see who are the contenders. And again, these guys probably don't want to do training camp, but it's good for them to see, okay, is there mutual interest here? So I wouldn't be surprised if they've already had a conversation with him like, hey, if we get to about week 4, week 5 and we see that, you know, this might align as a work.
So I have a fun fact.
Yeah.
He has not won a Super Bowl. He appeared in one Super Bowl and the Cardinals lost
Cardinals.
27-23.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's perfect, right?
Yeah.
Come to the Eagles and win one.
Exactly. Exactly. If not, he'll probably end up on the 49ers, so and then we'll hate his guts. But so, just to touch back on one of the other weaknesses of the unit, or maybe question marks, maybe it won't turn out to be a weakness, but marks as a number 2 pass rusher with Fletcher Cox gone. Any inclinations of who that could be? Just looking at the guys on the roster.
Yeah. You know, I was surprised watching some of the Dolphins tape who they had I mean they pretty much had ran trotted Wilkins and Sealer out there every down. Um so I don't necessarily expect that to change. I actually think Davis might get more third down snaps perhaps than you suggested. I think you did say you expected him to be primarily first and second, which, yeah, I 100% agree with that, but I don't think he'll be completely relegated to the bench on third downs. Williams obviously makes a ton of sense there because because he won't always be out there when they have four-man fronts. He can play more third downs. But yeah, they may also bring in someone who's not yet on the team. So it is a good question. If you had to make me guess, I would say Williams.
Yeah, this was like a sneaky, like on draft day. I sent out a tweet right before the draft of who are the first round players I'd like to have on the team. The bottom of my list, and I listed them in order who I wanted. The bottom of my list, the last two are Byron Murphy and Johnny Newton. For this exact reason, I think there is a question mark, and having interior pass rush productivity is, I think, a bigger benefit to a defense and even having that pass rush productivity from the edge. It's harder for quarterbacks to deal with that if they can't step up into the pocket. Having Carter is huge. The Rams had great defenses year in and year out and it was pretty much Aaron Donald was a major force there. That could very well be what the Eagles have. But if you compare that up with another good pass rusher, I mean, that is such a bonus to have. And you know what's great about the Eagles? We're sitting here talking about who's going to be our number two interior defensive lineman as a pass rusher. Most teams are trying to figure out who's going to be their stud interior defensive uh, pass rusher. And so this is a problem that good teams have. But still, when the rich want to get richer, and I think we want to find who can be that next guy. I think Brandon Graham's going to end up playing a good amount of snaps there. BG started playing there late in the season, and actually started playing over Carter some late in the season on third downs, which I was blew my mind a little bit. Probably should have played in place of Fletch and on some
Oh
of those
yeah, I changed
plays.
my mind.
You know,
Graham.
yeah, and so if you actually go back and look at the Dolphins last year, there was when they were all healthy, there was a good amount of third downs where Fangio was getting a little exotic, and he is bringing in. He would have Chubb, Jalen Phillips, and Andrew Van Ginkel rushing next to Christian Wilkins, and so I think we're gonna see some iteration of that. Do we see maybe Sweat moves inside and rushes from the inside, and then you got Bryce Huff on the outside, and you have Nolan Smith on the outside rushing too. We'll see who steps up out of those extra pass rushers to prove that they should be on the field, that they need to be on the field in those situations. But
You know,
I think
Patricia tried that. I noticed they did it was very infrequent, but I did see they tried Sweat on the inside. It was terrible. So
yeah,
but
I
yeah.
think it all. I think it all like, especially at that point in the season, that like nothing worked, right? But there have been times where Sweat has made plays happen rushing from the interior. Now I'm not saying it's going to be him. If Huff and Sweat are our best two edge rushers, then I think maybe you kind of want to leave them there and find someone else that can play inside. I mean, BG's done it his whole career of being a good. It's not like he was really good at it last year and limited snaps. His pressure rate was significantly higher than Fletch's. It was just on a very low snap share. Uh, but it's not like he's been doing this his whole career. It wasn't his first season where that happened. I think he's a candidate to be able to move inside some. And also too, even if you move Sweat inside or you move, let's say you put Nolan Smith inside, you're probably running games with them anyways. You're running stunts, you're running twist, you're trying to loop, set a pick for one guy and loop another one around. So I think it's going to take some coaching to find, or some scheming and some thinking outside of the box to find who that second interior pass rusher is going to be. I don't think it's going to be like, all right, we got these two studs, we're just going to line them up and let them play. I think it's going to be a bit of a patchwork to see who plays on third downs next to Jalen Carter.
Yeah. And one of the things I love about Graham is his pass rush discipline. And part of it is because it's not like he has a million finesse moves. But ultimately, him with that bull rush or the speed to power, just collapsing the pocket, gives the other pass rushers the opportunity to get the sack. And that was something that was severely lacking last year, was rush lane integrity, where guys would just, they'd go any direction they want to try to beat their man, and then they just leave this unbelievably large space for the quarterback to either scramble, run for yards, or just create a new platform for himself and deliver a throw.
Yeah. Yeah, and hopefully we see that a much better pass rush discipline this upcoming year. These guys missed out on a lot of sacks where if they just had good pass rush discipline, they would have fallen into sacks. Perfect example, Jalen Carter's first career sack didn't win, but the rest of the defensive line got enough pressure where it forced the quarterback to step up into him. Hopefully we see more of that this year. But I think so if we look back to last season, of all the interior defensive lineman snaps on third down, Fletch played 38% of those snaps. Jalen Carter was at 32%, I believe. I think we're aligned. I don't think we see two guys 30 plus percent. I think it's probably going to be a patchwork. You know, you might see some guys in the 20% range, some guys in the like mid teens. I think that's my thought on it. I don't know about yours.
Yeah, I think Carter will play an unbelievable number of snaps, and the rest will just be shuffled in and out.
Yeah. Okay, so let's I think we have two more topics we want to touch on just looking at the interior of the defensive line and first is about the way Vic Fangio uses his interior defensive linemen. I think it's a little bit different than what most people just assume from a Fangio defense, especially if you read all the stuff on the internet about like the fronts that he likes to use or what a Fangio defense looks like from teams that aren't Vic Fangio. So what did you see on this end, Eric?
Yeah, so I think when people hear Fangio, the first thing they think of is 3-4 defense, um, which gives you this vision of three interior defensive linemen squeezed tightly in towards the center, and then you have two stand up outside rushers, which is true. But the thing was, they didn't run that often. Sometimes you'll hear terms like base defense, and that has become analogous for, oh, this is what we run on 1st and 10. But that's not what they ran on 1st and 10, especially against 11 personnel with one running back, one tight end, and three receivers. You watched the Dolphins last year, and especially when they come out with played against some of these gunslinging quarterbacks, they were coming out in 4-man fronts. So they'd have Chubb and Phillips until he got hurt, and then Van Ginkel took his spot. Those would be the two stand-up outside rushers, and then they'd have Sealer and Wilkins in the inside. So I don't see any reason why that won't continue. They come out against the Cowboys, first play of the game, 1st and 10. It's not going to be a 5-man front. So I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. Where you will see those 5-man fronts is in rush downs, where it's like, short yardage situation, goal line. Sometimes they'll mix it in when it's longer down and distances at times, because that's where you have opportunities to get free rushers. Exotic blitz looks, to me, are more possible out of the 5-man front. That's also where you'll see one of the edge rushers drop back. So it will be there. Let's call it maybe 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 snaps. You'll see that kind of front. But what you should expect to see 1st and 10 against the Cowboys when they come out is Huff, Carter, Davis or Williams. That's one player, and then Sweat. That's what you should expect to see.
Yeah, and I was an idiot and didn't write these numbers down. But the numbers show like Vic Fangio has gone away from his what they call his penny and his tight fronts, where it's the 5 down, and so much so that he's now towards the bottom of the league in terms of how many snaps that he plays with a nose tackle. So looking up the numbers to find out these exact fronts, they just don't. It's just hard to find the exact fronts. For some reason, PFF Ultimate, you can look up how many times the defense aligned with a nose tackle, and that pretty much is going to tell you. And by nose tackle, I mean either head up on the center or shaded on the center. So that's really covering a lot of how many times they're playing these 5 down fronts. Earlier, and when he was with the Bears and with the Broncos, he was playing those fronts anywhere between the low to high 30% range. The past season, we saw a decline in that, starting his final season or his second and last season in Denver. So they're at 30% of their snaps they played with the nose tackle. The following season, they're at 27% of the snaps that they played with the nose tackle. And then this past season with Miami, they played, I think it was 18% of their snaps they played with the nose tackle. So, like you said, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 plays. That's about that 1 in 5 plays. How often you're going to see the Eagles come out in that front, and who knows? Maybe it's more of a situation where they didn't feel like they had a player good enough to play those um, play those fronts or play with the nose tackle, or maybe they felt like just their pairing of Christian Wilkins and Zach Sealer were best utilized in these four down fronts. I don't know the answer to that, but I do think it's interesting to note that the the Dolphins or Fangio really has started to go away from that when the rest of the league is trending towards that, and so much so that was here's where like a lot of times I see on Twitter people are talking about, oh, the Eagles are going to run a 3-4 defense now, and essentially what they're talking about is what we're talking about with these five down fronts. They've been doing that. I don't know why people think that we haven't been doing that. It's been a very common theme of our defense, really more so in 2022, which is why you saw Hassan Reddick drop into coverage a lot more in 2022 than when he did in 2023. He started to do it a lot more in the second half of the season in 2023, but that's because from the Chiefs game on, they really switched up their fronts that they're using. And the first half of the season, when it was Desai running the defense, they used a lot of their four down fronts. And then the second half of the season, they started to use a lot more five down fronts. And it's supposed to be better against stopping the run, and they just got worse at stopping the run. So it was like, not only were they worse at stopping the run, it makes you vulnerable to the pass, and it just was a shit show. But the Eagles I think 16th in the league. They ran that front at a 28% clip. The Dolphins, like I said, were around 18%, and I think they were like 27th in the league. The year prior, the Eagles had ran that front on 41% of the snaps or 40% of the snaps. So we see that we've seen this defense from the Eagles already. I think there's going to be a little bit of a change from what you see with Vic Fangio and the types of fronts that he's going to come out and use. Now, on top of that, talked about it a little bit. They're going to use stunts more. The Dolphins ran the ninth most stunts last season. Fangio's usually been around like average or maybe even slightly below average, but the Eagles, especially last season, were one of the lowest teams and their stunt rate. So I think we're going to see more line movement. I think we're going to see more exotic looks from the Eagles this season, and it should lead to more easy pressures, more of those unblocked pressures that we talked about. And I think hopefully, we're at the euphoria stage of the offseason. I think I'm really expecting this interior defensive line to get a little bit more pressure than they did last season, just because I think they're going to get some easier looks.
Yeah. And one of the things, and I don't know if the numbers back this up, I would expect that they do, is when I watched the Dolphins in the five-man fronts, I thought they played the run extremely well. So I'll be very curious to see if the numbers back that up. Much better than the Eagles. Now, it's pretty much impossible to tell how much you can attribute that to personnel differences as opposed to how it's coached. But I'm optimistic that the five-man fronts will play the run better than they have in the past. Or, back like in 22, they saw some better success.
Yeah, and 22 is like they had to go to that because they could not stop the run out of their four down fronts for whatever reason. It just the gap discipline wasn't there. They pretty much had to go and live exclusively in their five down fronts, whether that was they brought on two off ball linebackers and played more in that 3-4 that people are talking about, or they played with one off ball linebacker. So theoretically, you should be better at stopping the run that way because you're just plugging up more gaps in the front. You should be spilling everything to your off ball players. But we'll see. We'll see how it all works out. Different coaching staff, different year. We'll see. How it's going to end up playing. Let's look into some contract situations and long term outlooks. I think the most pressing one, or the guy that is for sure without a contract heading into the 2025 season, is Milton Williams. I think we talked on our Milton Williams podcast. We're probably a little against the grain. I think every Eagles fan is expecting the Eagles to re-sign Milton Williams. I just don't know if they're going to. And we talked about this a little bit. Like I said in the Milton Williams podcast, there's three types of players: players that you open up the checkbook for, the players that you will never open up the checkbook for, and players that are what are the cost? What are the cost players? I think whether Milton Williams comes back next year is dependent. And when I say comes back, I think is offered a contract where he would want to come back. I think that really depends on if he improves his standing as a pass rusher. Check out the Milton Williams episode as we dive deep more in depth about his pass rushing woes. But it's just hard for me to see a guy that's primarily his strength is primarily as a run defender, to especially when you got a guy like Moro Ojomo waiting in the wings who showed some really good stuff last season in limited snaps. If he shows with more snaps, he can be a good run defender as well. I just don't really see the benefit of spending money on him when you have a guy in a rookie contract that could probably fill his role. If maybe not to the 100% of what Milton Williams is doing, but if you could get 90%, 80% of what he gives you on rundowns, what's the cost benefit to bringing him back or investing that money at a different position, linebacker? But you know, I got to see more out of Milton Williams as a pass rusher before I'm like, okay, we for sure got to bring him back. And to me, we talked about it a little bit, but I think it's one of those. If you wait too long, his contract balloons out of place, right? But it's one of those where they got to see in training camp, hey, is this guy looking a little different in training camp or early in the season? Is he really flashing as a pass rusher? I think at that point in time, if he signs a long term contract, it'll be either in training camp or early in the season.
Yeah. If it's one of these Howie specials where he extends the cap hit over a bunch of years with some option bonuses and it's cost controlled, sure, I'll take him. If it's above market value, I 100% agree. I would rather allocate the resources to a different position. Um, just touching on Davis, so after this year he'll have one more year at the rookie price, and then we'll have to decide on a 5th-year option. So I think this is the big season coming up. This will determine his long-term outlook with the Eagles. If I had to guess now, I'd say yes. I'd say they're gonna go for it, keep him, and then you don't have to worry about. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you this: do you think they pick up his 5th-year option? Are we talking about Davis or are we talking about Milton?
Davis.
Okay. Do you think they're going to pick up his 5th-year option? And just keep in mind, you have to agree to that before they enter their 4th year as a rookie. So next offseason, they'd have to make that decision.
Yeah.
Do you think they're going to pick up that 5th-year option, knowing it's expensive? It's based on, what it's based somewhat on the your performance, how many Pro Bowls you made, things like that. So his 5th-year and also the current defensive tackle market. So it might not be a huge 5th-year option, but what are your thoughts? Do you think it's?
It depends on the number for sure. I'm not sure if there's a projection for what that number would be.
Considering he hasn't made a Pro Bowl, it'll be on the lower end.
So we're talking what, maybe 10, 12 million or in that range?
Okay, so we just looked up the numbers, and this is based on 2023, but based on his criteria of most likely not reaching a Pro Bowl and his playing time criteria, it's looking like in 2023, his 5th-year option would have been a little over $10 million. Now, I think what it will be with the new salary cap and next offseason, I think it's probably going to be closer to 12 million. But would you bring him back at that price point?
One quick note is pretty much if throw raw values like dollars and cents out the window. If you're talking about contracts, you should always look at percentage of cap. So for what's equivalent to 10 million in 2023 cap dollars, I would. Remember, we talked about there's not really many other reliable run defenders, guys who can line up as nose tackle, and it's so far, it happened so long ago by the time they're going to sign the 5th-year option that it's like does draft capital still weigh into your calculus? But like to me, it does a little bit. So yeah, I project him to get the 5th year option accepted if it's in that range.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if they do either. But honestly, at that point in time, I feel like they're gonna have a long-term contract worked out, or they're gonna be working towards a long-term contract anyways, if they do decide to pick up that option. Um, Honestly, I before looking up the numbers, I thought it was gonna be much higher. If you look at the top end of what he could have been making, and on his 5th year option was closer to like 18 to $20 million. At that price point, it's like, okay, no. But if you're looking at a guy that's 10 to $12 million for a 5th year option, okay, I can see that for a guy like Davis. And even if he's not, like we talked about him a little bit and his, we talked about this point a little bit in his in-depth breakdown, but even though he might not have huge pass rush numbers, he affects the pass in multiple different ways, whether he's pushing the pocket and collapsing it and making things easier for other guys around him, or the fact that, like what Kirby Smart built his defenses in Georgia around, he said that he liked to dedicate as few resources as possible to stopping the run so he could dedicate more resources to stopping the pass because of Carter's ability to eat blocks and help you play with light boxes. He does affect the pass game to some degree. Now, he's not going to be a guy out there getting double digit sacks, but I think it's not like he's a 290-pound defensive run stopping defensive tackle that isn't a good pass rusher. I think he is a guy that can provide value in the pass game, even if he's not directly impacting it. So I think he is worth it.
Yeah, and if his conditioning issues look unsolvable, then there's no way, right? So it's kind of like a binary thing. And maybe I do sound hypocritical because I said I was a little pessimistic about him fixing those. So we'll just have to see how it
Yeah.
materializes. Um,
This is almost like a contract year, I feel like, for Davis, and to some degree. I feel like he needs to have a big year this year if he really for his long-term prospects with the Eagles. I think it's a big
and
year
just
for
like
him.
they did with Devontae, they'll accept the 5th year and extend all in one go. And then
Yeah.
the player, they can get a bunch of money in 2 successive years because it all hits at once. So it's kind of nice for both parties if you want to keep the guy long term. So we'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, so outside of that, I think it's Williams you got to make a decision on, and then you got Jordan Davis, who like you're gonna have to make some decisions on this offseason. After that, Carter will be coming up after, but I mean we're talking a few seasons from now. Uh, but I think other than that, this team long term is set to some degree. I do think you do want to find that long term second pass rusher to pair with Jalen Carter. But long term outlook for this position group, when you have a guy that I project and you project to be likely to be as dominant as Carter should be and already has been to a large degree as a rookie, um, the long term prospects at the position are great. And I'm really excited to see how they can continue to develop and build up this room.
Yeah, and all those stud defensive tackles around the league, you mentioned this, they kind of hit their peak around year 4. So Carter's not even close to that. So it his ascendancy, I don't think it surprised people who scouted him because he looked unbelievable. But yeah, you definitely hope he's an Eagle for life. And if he performs the way we expect him to, I think he will be.
Yep, 100%. Now, did you have any final closing thoughts on the position before we get out of here?
Yeah, the only thing, and I mentioned this in the individual podcasts we recorded, was I am concerned that Fangio may overuse the top two guys, Carter and Davis. We know for a fact Carter will get a ton of snaps. It remains to be seen how much shuffling there will be with Davis and other players. We didn't even mention him, but the backup nose tackle, PJ Mustafer, he might make the team. And if he does, I would expect it to be specifically to give Davis a breather. Um, and then you have like the guys like Ojomo, who I'd love to see more of. When he first came out there last year, I was like, "Who's this very small guy?" And then I was like, "Wow, look at that small guy! Like he's pretty good." Sometimes you wear rose-colored glasses when players perform good in small sample sizes. If you look at Nicholas Morrow from last year in like 4 to 6 game sample size for the beginning, like to me, objectively, he looked really good. And then his pedigree is not of like a starting Mike linebacker in the NFL or anything like this. And then his warts started to show up more as the season went on. So that, that's possible that you would see that with Ojomo. But I've heard that the team really likes him. So it's potential he might get in the mix more.
Nice. That's good for the Ojomo truthers out there. So definitely looking forward to seeing how this unit develops as the year goes on. There's going to be a lot of changes. It's a much younger group than we've had in years past. So I think there's going to be, listen, we're going to see some surprises, both good and bad. So I'm really looking forward to it. Now, we're going to be going through the rest of the offseason and having discussions like these and kind of doing some deep dives on players like we did in our previous 3 episodes. So if you haven't seen those deep dives, make sure to take a look at those. But we're going to be previewing all of the position groups for the Eagles as the offseason goes on. So make sure to stay tuned. And until next time, take it easy.